So let me go to Jose Saldana, who promised to give us a perspective on the sort of origins of mass incarcerations in the US, as well as how this has impacted on Black people. And in the context also of the rise in the present moment, or rather the weaponization of white supremacy as a basis of continuing to marginalize others. It will be useful to hear from you how your work can feed into this conversation that we want to build in order for us to understand structural drivers, origins, and probably come to a solution. So I will now invite Jose, so that you can take the floor. Thank you. 10 minutes.
Greetings, everyone. Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, whatever it is where you at. My name is Jose Hamza Saldana. I am formerly incarcerated. Nearly 3 years ago, I was released from prison after close to 4 decades of incarceration. So a lot of what I speak about from my personal experience that has defined my consciousness and my perspective on this very, very important discussion. And because it feels so honored to come from a prison cell where I was serving a life sentence to being a part of this urgent discussion. It is a great honor, and I feel very, very fortunate. We trace the origins of mass incarceration in the United States to a specific incidents that actually happened around the world. During the 1950s and 1960s, the so-called third world countries around the world were fighting for national liberation from colonial oppression, neo-colonial oppression. This political and social consciousness spread in communities of colors across the United States. Grassroots movements evolved, calling for community control, racial justice, and social justice, and an end to the terror of police murder and brutality. Indigenous people of the United States, the so-called American Indian, they had movements that also called for racial and social justice and an end to law enforcement terror. The Black Panther Party, the Brown Berets, which called for racial and social justice for the Mexican Americans in the United States and the western part of the country. The Young Lords Party, a Puerto Rican version of the Black Panther Party, which addressed the conditions, the horrific conditions of Puerto Rican people in the urban areas of the United States. And I was also a member of that party, as well as the Puerto Rican independence movement. These are just examples of the grassroots movements that were calling for control of their communities and for basic fundamental human rights. In 1979, the FBI, the leading law enforcement agency in the United States, made a bold racist declaration that the Black Panther Party was the biggest threat to the national security of the United States. We're talking about a political reform party that created the free breakfast program to address a need of children going to understaffed schools, public schools, hungry because their parents could not give them breakfast before they went to school. So the Black Panther Party addressed this crisis by creating the free breakfast program. And for this, they were declared the biggest threat, the greatest threat to the national security of the United States. And just 2 years later, the government of the United States will launch the war on drugs. The war on drugs was just a cover for the war on Black people and brown people all over the country and the communities that they were a part of. So this war on drugs focused on the leadership of these grassroots movements and the communities that supported their efforts to resist racial and social injustice. The national policies of mass incarceration was created as the final solution to decisively suppress all support for resistance to racial and social injustice, neutralize grassroots leadership, and maintain control of these communities. The entire criminal legal system across the United States is dominated by the legacy of racism. And it became legal to target communities of color. Assassinations of grassroots community leaders became legal. Laws were enacted to criminalize entire communities. Laws enacted to prosecute teenagers, Black and brown teenagers, as adults and give them life sentences. Laws were enacted to give anyone who'd been arrested and convicted for any crime 3 times, it doesn't matter what crime it was, 3 times would be subject to a life sentence. All promoted the large-scale mandatory life sentence to be imposed on people. Virtual life sentences, which has been determined to be anything over 50 years, was given out to just about anything for any particular crime. And hundreds of political prisoners were sentenced to death by incarceration sentences. 100 years, 135 years, plus a life sentence. Black and Latinx people were disproportionately given these type of life sentences. Every decade during the height of mass incarceration, every decade, the population of Black and Latinx incarcerated people would double and continue to double for 3 consecutive decades. Recently, Black women were determined to be the fastest growing population of incarcerated women. And this is a fact. This is something that has to be taken into consideration because it has devastating impacts on the family. So we have a system that was created to separate mothers, fathers, grandfathers, grandmothers, great-great-grandmothers, great-great-grandfathers from families. This constituted permanent family separation, and it lasted for generations. These racist policies of mass incarceration were so devastating to the Black and Latinx families and communities that it actually constitutes a form of neo-genocide. And for Black people in prison, it was an extension of slavery. Just a few months ago, I know most of you may have seen this, a few months ago, the entire world witnessed 4 minutes or 8 minutes and 44 seconds of a broad daylight knee lynching of a Black man by a group of white racist police officers. This was a glimpse of what Black and Latinx people inherit at birth. The same racist sanction of murder and brutality that exists in the streets of America also exists behind the prison walls of prisons all over America, where Black men, Latinx men, and even women are brutally beaten to death. There are no cameras there to videotape it, or they are tortured in solitary confinement, not only for years, but for decades of being in solitary confinement, where some people take their own life. The majority of deaths in prisons across America are Black and Latinx people. The vast majority of those who commit suicide in solitary confinement are Black and Latinx people. In a country, as already was mentioned, that leads the world in incarcerating human beings, 75% of Black and Latinx people. A country that leads the world in people serving life sentences. You will think that if prisons and incarceration equal public safety, America will be the safest country in the world. But it isn't. It isn't because mass incarceration was never intended to be about public safety. mass incarceration was intended to be the final solution to controlling the communities, not just economically, but politically, and the entire structure, the family structure of the Black and Latinx communities. So what we have today is marginalized communities who are, for the most part, powerless to determine their own destiny. If we continue on this path, we will create a society that depends on prisons as the only solution to resolve societal problems that were created by the legacy of racism. Unless we pursue reforms that address the legacy of racism, we will never address this problem. We have to uproot the legacy of racism and leave not a seed of it behind for us to actually be in a position where we control what happens and what doesn't happen in our communities. Crimes are really the product of the society that we all inherited. I know because I was in prison for nearly 4 decades, and we in prison created the therapeutic programs that transform our lives. I would not be the person that I am today if elders that came before me, and unfortunately, most of them have perished in prison. But these elders were the ones who helped me and helped literally a generation of men and women transform their lives so that they could return back to their home communities as returning citizens of that community, ready and willing to be a part of the solution-making process of their home communities. This is the solution because we have to address racism. If we do not address racism, reforms that do not address racism takes us nowhere. We have to uproot this with finality so that we as human beings can develop human relationships with each other and that others will respect and honor the humanity and dignity of all human beings in society. Thank you.